Ludwig Wittgenstein's first published work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, one of the great manifestos of positivism, and it's decidedly a young man's work. It's elegant, clean, and very decisive in the sort of skepticism that it advocates and the sort of position that it takes with regard to logic and with regard to thought. Wittgenstein's work, his early work, the Tractatus, was 70 pages which elaborated essentially 7 sentences. And these sentences are remarkable for their cogency, for the clarity with which he expresses them, and in particular for the ruthless and very determined skepticism which he extrapolates from this conception of language and logic that's in the Tractatus. The Tractatus amounts to a theory of the declarative sentence, a theory of what can be put in a proposition and what cannot. And what Wittgenstein says is this, that essentially anything that can be said can either be said clearly or not at all. So he's a real yes or no kind of a man, a very logically clear, decisive individual who has a professional competence in mathematics, who comes from a background in engineering, and who has both an extremely practical orientation towards his subject matter, but also he has the desire for mathematical rigor and mathematical formality, which lends to it a character which is not unlike anything else in the Western philosophical tradition. Now what he says is essentially this in his early work, the Tractatus. The first sentence is, "The world is all that is the case," which is perhaps one of the most mysterious lines in philosophy. It sounds very clear, but I'm not entirely sure what that means. It certainly means that the states of affairs that we find around us, the simple facts, are what the world is for us. It's a way of saying that there will be no metaphysics in this book, that it will be a strictly one world interpretation of what can be thought and what can be said. After that first sentence, there's another series of sentences and then elaborations on each of these sentences. Now, if you look at the Tractatus, you'll find that he chooses a particular form. He numbers his sentences, like a scientific fellow that he is. And the first sentence is followed by sentence number 2, but sentence number 2 is followed by sentence number 2.1, 2.01, 2.02. In other words, he works out all the logical entailments, all the logical implications of the views that he holds, and then moves on. So he intends to be logically exhaustive. He intends to tell you what can and cannot be put into language. And since he views the limits of our language as the limits of our, at least social thought, what he is trying to do is tell us what we can and cannot sensibly talk about. The last sentence in the Tractatus is quite remarkable. What he says is, after finishing the 70 pages of extrapolation and elaboration of this theory of language, he says, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. What that means, of course, is that he is expelled, he is excommunicated many different kinds of discourse into the realm of nonsensicality. In many respects, Wittgenstein is as skeptical as a person can get. Only that which can be expressed can be taken seriously as a set of philosophical propositions, and once you get to the limits of our language, we have reached the limits of our thought. The possibility of going beyond language simply doesn't exist. If we were going to eschew language, if we were going to get beyond it and eliminate it, what would we do when we tried to communicate, when we tried to think? I mean, we'd have to hold hands and have a seance and try and read each other's minds. So once we've gotten to the very limits of language, we've also gotten to the perimeter of that which can be known. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, the young man who wrote the Tractatus, believed that he had solved all possible philosophical problems. Not only all philosophical problems that had been developed in the previous 2,500 years of philosophy, but all philosophical problems that could ever be raised. Because if you're going to ask a question, it's going to be in language, and one assumes that the response to your interrogatory will be a declarative statement, and if it fits into his theory of the declarative statement, then it checks out, and we're okay. But if it doesn't, well, then it's simply gibberish. The popular expression of this is found in A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. The lecture that Professor Staloff just gave gives you a very clear conception of the profound skepticism and the extreme logical tidiness that we find in this tendency in philosophy. You could call logical positivism physics uber alles, physics over everything. We have logic, we have physics. That's what real serious scientific philosophers do. Anything else is essentially poetry or religion or neurosis or something like that. It's not to be taken seriously by real tough philosophers. Now, Wittgenstein's book caused a sensation among the handful of people that initially could make any sense of it, because it is an exceedingly difficult book. It is surely one of the most difficult works in modern philosophy. Should any of you be brave enough to undertake a reading of it, first take a course in formal logic, and then prepare to give up 6 months or a year of your life. That's not a joke, perfectly serious. Now, Wittgenstein's book, when published, created a tremendous sensation. He got a professorship at Cambridge, and he was lionized. Everywhere, students and professors of philosophy said, finally we've had a real breakthrough. Finally we've had someone who on his own could create new approaches to philosophical problems that were unprecedented, that were easy to understand, or not easy, but understandable and communicable, and it seemed to be definitive. As I said before, the author of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus thought that he had solved all possible philosophical problems. A remarkable attempt, if not a remarkable success. Now, as his work was absorbed, as he got a band of admiring, or perhaps not even admiring, adoring students and colleagues, Wittgenstein became rather uneasy. Now, perhaps it's a question of temperament. Some philosophers like the idea of being adored. If you think of someone like Hegel, students would have to adore someone like that, would have to look up to him. That would make him feel that he was moving in the right path in philosophy. On the other hand, it disturbed Wittgenstein profoundly. Wittgenstein said, well, are you sure that I'm completely right? Are you certain that everything I've said here is absolutely true? Is there really no way out of this logical corner I've painted myself into? As a matter of fact, is it possible that this book, so rigorous and analytic and formal, is wrong? Now, in that respect, he was not only light years ahead of his contemporaries in putting this book together, but he was several more light years ahead of them in calling it into question. So at just the time, during the 1930s, when he is reaching tremendous international renown, tremendous international success, Wittgenstein, the isolated, somewhat odd Socratic, had to ask himself, am I sure, and how do I know? And he offered a self-criticism of his own work, which was more trenchant and more powerful than any criticism that could be leveled at it from the outside. So just as everyone in the world was beginning to worship at the idol of the young Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, the toughest logical guy around, Wittgenstein began to have misgivings, and these misgivings generated a whole series of work that occupied the entirety of his life until he died in the early 50s. He refused to publish after the Tractatus. He did publish one paper under protest, decided that he didn't like it after he had done it, and would put nothing else in print. He circulated a few manuscripts among his students and among his friends, among his colleagues, but he didn't like to put anything in print because it seems so final, and it seems that philosophy is more a process than a series of absolute certainties, and he was moving away from the logical hubris that was characteristic of the Tractatus. His most important work, the latest of his works, is called The Logical Investigations, and that too is one of the most profound and interesting works of philosophy in the 20th century. It's not so forbidding or so obviously difficult as the Tractatus, because it lacks a lot of the logical formulae and things like that, but in fact it's one of the most difficult and rigorous pieces of work ever produced. And it's a sort of exercise in philosophical humility, which is not terribly common among philosophers, if you've been listening to the other lectures that we've had so far. And it shows us, not instead of the logical necessity of language, it talks about the practical contingency of language. He appreciates the ambiguity and the difficulties that attach to our everyday practical use of language, rather than a sort of abstract, completely logical, architectonic formalization of all possible linguistic constructs. Now, the Investigations is a series of paragraphs, not quite so tidy as the series of sentences that we see in the Tractatus, but Wittgenstein says, the book is incomplete. I would have written you in the introduction. He says, I would have written a good book if I could, but I was just outside my capacities, so this will have to do. He says, at best, it's an album, a series of therapies to uncloud our understanding of the world, which is clouded up by the way we use language. Wittgenstein once said that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence through language. Oddly enough, and it may seem rather strange in a rather logical and physicalistic sort of philosopher like Wittgenstein, there are many exceedingly poetic passages in Wittgenstein. It's an odd place to find poetry, but in fact, the clarity and the rigor of Wittgenstein's writing, both in the early period when he was writing the Tractatus and in the later period when he put together the Investigations, is quite astonishing. And simply as a read for the poetry of it, getting odd insights into language and thought, that itself justifies it. So if you're going to read Wittgenstein at a later date, have a look at the Investigations. It's a most interesting piece of work, and you'll probably find it more rewarding than the Tractatus. Now, in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein had an idea, or made essentially the argument, or had the basic conception that language was a picture of the world, and that each individual atomic proposition told us something about the world, or it told us about some logical fact. So there were two kinds of meaningful propositions in the Tractatus, and only two. There were deductive facts, and there were inductive facts. Deductive facts are either true or false, and he worked out the implications of that. It turns out that all true deductive statements, all analytic facts, are in fact tautologies. In other words, they only tell you that X is X. Now, it may be a very abstract set of equations on both sides, but really what it all reduces to is everything is itself. Every mathematical equation says that this is this, and nothing more. It tells us nothing about the world, it just tells us about the logical entailments in our definitions. Very clean, very precise. He has a razor blade of a mind, and he cuts right through all the nonsense, all the complexities to get to one basic core. In the Tractatus, he also says that another kind of proposition expresses the contingent states of affairs in the world. The chair is there, the audience is here, I'm walking up and down. All these propositions tell us individual facts about the world, and these are not tautologies, these are not contradictions, they are simple contingencies. And the way you find out about them is by looking at the world. Elegant, simple, lovely. Perhaps a little too simple, perhaps an oversimplification. In his later work, when he gets to the Investigations, Wittgenstein has decided that instead of language being a picture, he wants to treat language as a game, as a set of social practices which overlap and which don't have one universal skeleton key which allows us to open all linguistic doors. Instead, there are a plurality of overlapping games which have a certain degree of consistency within them, but there's no one unifying characteristic that covers all possible linguistic expressions. The idea of a great philosopher, a philosopher who had achieved enormous international notoriety, retracting his first and most widely known work, is unprecedented in the history of philosophy, and one of the great achievements in human self-criticism, the capacity to be critical towards oneself as well as others, the rigorous intellectual honesty is what comes out of the Investigations, and it is enormously impressive in that respect. Now let's think about the idea of language games. Wittgenstein says that there are different kinds of games that we play, and that language can be subsumed under that idea, and that not all these games are perfectly identical, and that there's a certain degree of ambiguity that attaches to some games rather than others. And in fact, the plurality and diversity of language makes it resist any attempt to find a universal kind of algorithm which allows you to get through all of it. Remarkable change of intellectual orientation comes here. Now, the question is, if we're to take this idea of language games seriously, we have to figure out what we would mean by a language game, how these games will work, and what it is that's different in this second conception, this conception of the language game, that makes it different from the conception that he had earlier. Two of Wittgenstein's favorite questions come into play here. One of his favorite questions is, how is a word learned? That is to say, if you want to know about the meaning of a word, X, then ask yourself, how do you find out about X? How would you teach X to a 6-year-old? because as a matter of practical, empirical fact, all the 6-year-olds, all the children in our culture are going to have to be taught the words of English, and they get taught them one by one. Ask yourself how you would teach a word. That will tell you a great deal about what the word means and what the word signifies. In addition to that, he wants to know, a second question that Wittgenstein is particularly interested in is, how is a word used? One of the slogans that was derived from this a little later in Wittgenstein's development was, don't ask for the meaning, ask for the use. If you want to know what X means, ask yourself what people do with it. Go look at people using the word X and find out what it's good for. And when you know how they use it, well, you know what it means. This change from the logical necessity of language to its practical contingency is a fascinating turnabout. Now, let's think about the word game. I assume all of us have a sufficient command of English to roughly know what a game is. And the problem is one of definition. How will we define game? Well, let's think about our 6-year-old. Let's call him Johnny. And let's say we want to teach a game to Johnny. Now, by 6, most children actually know what a game is already. And the question is this: how did we teach Johnny the term game? And how do we know when Johnny understands the word game? And what does it mean for us to define the word game? Well, we'd have to drop back a little bit and see what Wittgenstein is fighting against in the Western philosophical tradition. In other words, what's the definition of definition in the Western philosophical tradition? A kind of meta question, kind of bootstraps us up into a new level. And the best example, the best contrast you can find is in the works of Plato. Socrates is constantly asking people, what is justice? What is goodness? What is virtue? What is beauty? And what he's asking for is a definition, because in each of the Socratic dialogues, there's an attempt to define some important abstract concept. And in fact, in the process of defining it, Socrates has very clear criteria for what counts as a definition. Those of you who are familiar with the Republic know that Socrates wants to define justice. Those of you who are familiar with the Phaedrus know that Socrates wants to define love. Those of you who are familiar with the Meno know that Socrates wants to define virtue. When Socrates in the Meno asks Meno what is virtue, Meno gives him a bunch of examples. There's the virtue of generals, the virtue of soldiers, the virtue of men, the virtue of women. And Socrates says, no, stop. I don't want examples of virtue. I want to know what virtue itself is. I want to know some quality that every virtue has and only virtue has. In other words, Socrates demands that virtue be defined in the way that we define odd numbers or triangles. He wants the canons for definition to be strictly mathematical. It goes back to the fact that the Greeks were primarily concerned with mathematical epistemological questions, or at least Plato was. And Socrates wins many arguments by showing that nobody understands what virtue or justice or beauty is, because no one can tell him what the form of it is. No one can tell him what every instantiation of beauty has and only instantiations of beauty has. No one can tell him what every example of virtue has and only examples of virtue have. It's not an accident that Socrates, whenever he gives an example of what he wants a definition to be, always chooses some mathematical entity. Mathematical things lend themselves to that kind of definition. The difficulty that Wittgenstein has stumbled on, and it's a fascinating problem, is that many things are not and cannot be defined that way. In other words, he thinks Socrates is unintentionally playing intellectual sleight of hand by demanding of people something that couldn't possibly be there. And then it turns out that when the people try and give him what he wants, they end up looking stupid because they're on an expedition to do the impossible. A remarkable insight. Wittgenstein offers us a new idea. Let's go back to Johnny and the game. Johnny understands the game. And what's remarkable is that none of us sat down and said, Johnny, every game has the following quality and only games have the following qualities. Johnny, this is the form of the game. As a matter of fact, if called upon to tell someone what the form of the game is, in other words, if called upon to say some quality that every game has and only games have, I think you'd run into all kinds of problems. Ask yourself what the Olympics have in common with tic-tac-toe. Ask yourself what poker has in common with chess. Ask yourself what tag has in common with peekaboo. Ask yourself if any of these things have one universal characteristic that allows us to say that all these things are games. If they don't have one universal characteristic, how is it that we can use the word in a sensible way? What does it mean to describe all these things as games? Wittgenstein has opened up a can of skeptical worms here, and he's going to close it too. Quite remarkable. Let's go back to Johnny and our game. We teach Johnny peekaboo, we teach Johnny maybe a card game, we teach Johnny how to play checkers, we teach Johnny a number of games. How do we know when Johnny understands the term game? What we do is we look for some behavior, some use on the part of Johnny that shows that he knows where it fits in our language. So for example, if he starts writing his homework and he says, this thing that I'm writing my homework with, that's a game, we say, no, Johnny, you don't understand. That's not a game, that's a pencil. A game is a thing like tag or checkers or cards or something like that, Johnny. But notice we don't say, Johnny, the following is the form of the game. We give Johnny examples. So what Wittgenstein is saying here is that as a matter of practical fact, all of us, not just Johnny, but all of us, learn the use of words like game, everyday simple things like that, by being given examples. This is called ostensive definition. In other words, in contrast to the Socratic essential definition, by specifying one quality that every X has and only X has, Wittgenstein wants to offer us a new paradigm that will cover some kinds of definition. In fact, it will cover most kinds of definition. This will be definition by giving examples of something. So if you want to teach someone that doesn't understand English, speaks a foreign language, what a chair is, you point out examples of chairs. You say, sir, that's a chair, and sir, that's a chair, and that's a chair, and that's a chair, and that's a chair. And then at some point in time, you get tired of saying, that's a chair, that's a chair, that's a chair, then you stop. And then after that, if you want to find out if this person understands the word chair, you ask them, could you use that in a sentence and point out a few things? And if they point to the sky, or if they point to a mountain, you understand that they don't understand what you meant by chair, and you have to give them some more examples. If, on the other hand, he says, that's a chair, that's a chair, that's a chair, then you have as good a reason as you are ever going to have to think that he understands the word chair. And this is not restricted to the word game. It is not restricted to the word chair. This accounts for almost all the definitions we have of almost all the words we use every day. It's remarkable about Wittgenstein that unlike Plato and Spinoza, who can confuse us and baffle us with the most profound intellectual constructs, Wittgenstein can baffle us with the contents of our closets. Wittgenstein can baffle us with the objects on the table. Wittgenstein can make it amazing that you should know how to use the word sugar or salt. Remarkable, but not remarkable. What Wittgenstein has done is gone back to the way words actually work in the practical, empirical world. He started out his career as an engineer, and then he moved into mathematics, and the desire for mathematical formality sacrificed common sense. And now, this is a revival of common sense. This is common sense in a way with a vengeance. Think about the paradigm of 6-year-olds. If they understand what game means, don't tell me that us philosophers don't. And if we can't specify some quality that every instantiation of the word game has, and only such instantiations have, then why should we believe that there is such a thing? Now, this doesn't sound like all that great a breakthrough, perhaps, but stop and consider it. Imagine someone that had spent, a scholar, spent his entire life trying to figure out what it is that makes beautiful things beautiful. And he looked at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, he looked at Rembrandt's portraits, he looked at the Sistine Chapel, he looked at a number of things, and racked his brain for a whole career, 20, 30, 40 years, trying to figure out some quality that all these things have in common. And the difficulty may be in the kind of question that we're asking. They may not have anything intrinsically in common that unites all of them. There may be a series of overlapping commonalities that allow us to refer to all these things in a rough and approximate way. It doesn't give us ultimate Platonic precision. It won't turn us into logic machines. But the demand for final logical precision may be the problem here rather than the fuzziness of our language. It may be that we're making impossible and unreasonable demands when we ask for the form of the chair, for the essential quality of every chair and only chairs. Perhaps what we need is a series of examples that work in a rough, practical way in the language games that we live with. In other words, the fact that I can't specify for you some quality that every game has and only games have doesn't mean that you don't know what I'm talking about when I use the word game, and doesn't mean I can't teach it to Johnny. And what more do you want to do with it? Aren't we asking the impossible? Fascinating idea. Now there's a problem here, and Plato would be the first one to come back. I mean, let's be fair to him. He'd say, look, How do we know when we really understand something? Maybe Johnny is going to go out and misuse the word later on, and there's an intrinsic ambiguity to defining things by example. That is to say, there's always going to be an uncertainty when you get to the peripheral examples of a game or a chair or anything else as to whether this falls under the rubric chair or game or not. Is a doll's house chair a chair? Well, maybe. Is a throne a chair? Well, I guess. If you sit on a boulder, is that a chair? Well, kind of. I mean, it becomes kind of difficult at the edges. And here's where Plato would come back and say, look, logic or nothing. Tell me with perfect certainty or I don't want to hear about it. Wittgenstein's answer is elegant and quite poetic. He says, when you demand absolute logical precision, a rigid, clear distinction between the things that fall under a term and things that do not, aren't you demanding the impossible? He says something to this effect. Is a fuzzy photograph a photograph? Well, yeah. Is it adequate for certain purposes? Well, it depends on what purposes you want to do, you want it for. In other words, is a fuzzy definition a definition? Well, Plato would say no. Why? Because he wants absolute certainty. That's what the Greek tradition is all about. Wittgenstein says the problem is not with our language, the problem is not with our thinking, the problem is with the demand for absolute certainty about the nature of chairness. There is no such thing. There's just this chair and the other chair, and there's an intrinsic ambiguity built into our definitions along those lines that's exactly like the ambiguity that we find in a fuzzy photograph. Think of a satellite's photograph of the United States. You might object that it's not clear that your backyard is there. Wittgenstein would say, well, if we need more resolution, we can add that resolution as it's necessary in the language games we are engaged in. But insofar as we just want a satellite's photo of the United States, this does just fine. If you want your backyard, I suppose we could clarify it somewhat. And insofar as our language games demand that we bring it down to the level of the backyard, that we increase the specificity, we can always add that as we need it. But we don't need a priori an ultimate essential definition of all the words in our language prior to being able to talk. Talk comes first. Action comes first. These logical systemizations of it come second, and insofar as they create a nonsensical ambiguity in our understanding of ourselves and our world, the fault lies not with the world, the fault lies not with our language, the fault lies with an unreasonable demand for unreasonable degrees of certainty. What a remarkable idea. It's absolutely brilliant. And if you can imagine now our poor scholar looking at the Sistine, listening to Beethoven's Ninth, appreciating Rembrandt, and then saying, I've been asking the wrong question. All I have is overlapping elements of beauty that attach to different things in different ways, and they may have a rough similarity, but that's all we're going to get. So instead of a Platonic form of beauty, what we're going to get is the beauty characteristic of portraits, perhaps we could define that with some precision. The beauty characteristic of pieces of music, perhaps for some purposes we would want to connect one to the other, perhaps we would want to distinguish them. But the problem lies not with the world, the problem lies with our over-demanding of logical rigor. Now, what this means is that we're going to have to find some principle that holds our world together, because there's a danger here. Suppose we were to say that some term X in some language referred to ladies' shoes, all the numbers over 200, and lobsters. Well, the problem is that there's no connection between these things. In other words, we don't want to be so completely disparate that we get a totally arbitrary set of utterances referring to the world. And Wittgenstein comes up with another beautiful, poetic paradigm for this, and this is called family resemblance. Imagine the Smith family, hypothetical group of people. They all look roughly alike. Some are taller, some are shorter, some weigh more, some weigh less. Some have long hair, some have short hair, but they all look roughly like the Smith family. Why do we call them Smiths? Because we see a family resemblance between this and this and this. And Wittgenstein says, let's extrapolate from that idea. Let's take the idea that all the chairs have a rough family resemblance. They're things built by people so that you can sit on them. And then, naturally, there'll be some ambiguous cases on the fringe. Is a doll's house chair a chair? Is a throne a chair? Is the front seat of your car a chair? Well, it depends on what you want to do with it. But the point is, the reason why we might be tempted to call these various things chairs is because they share a certain family resemblance that allows us to clump these common nouns together, or the things that are referred to by these common nouns together. And this family resemblance idea is what we are looking for when we try and define a term. So when we choose examples of chairs to teach Johnny with, we don't choose the odd cases that are unclear. We choose things that are very clearly chairs. That's a chair, and that's a chair, and that's a chair. When Johnny comes back and wants to know if some questionable case, the doll's house chair, is a chair, we say, well, it depends on what you want to do with it, Johnny. If you want to build doll houses, maybe we'll call it a chair. If you want to talk only about things that people can really sit on, well, then it's not a chair. It depends on what language game you're playing. Now let's think about game, the definition of game. It seems like what holds our word game together is the fact that games have a rough family resemblance. Poker is kind of like bridge in that you play them with cards. Chess is sort of like checkers in the sense that you play it on a 64 square board. And chess is sort of like poker in the sense that both are governed by rules. But there'll still be fuzzy questions and fuzzy instances of what counts as a game. Consider, for example, peekaboo. If we wanted to say that games were human behaviors that are governed by rules, you'd have the difficulty of peekaboo. No one explains to an infant, these are the ground rules of peekaboo, kid, before you play it. You just play peekaboo and it really doesn't have any rules, or I don't know, I mean, how can you be offsides in peekaboo? Think about it. Right? I mean, it's peekaboo. Is peekaboo a game? Well, if you want to include it for certain purposes, say under the rubric things children do, okay, it's a game. I mean, it would be very peculiar to do among adults. On the other hand, if you want to say that games are rule-oriented behaviors, well, then it's not. What hangs on the question of whether we can absolutize this or not? Wittgenstein points out, nothing. What a liberation from physics uber alles. What a tribute to common sense and everyday experience. What a great intellectual honesty that allows him to break through this into a new domain of rough expressions, of everyday language, of the way we really live. Wittgenstein says in a very memorable passage that some mathematician had tried to demand complete logical rigor. His name was Gottlob Frege. And he said that a term that isn't defined perfectly is like an area in geometry that has an imperfect definition. If it's not bounded completely, it's not an area, which means it's not a definition. But Wittgenstein says, no, that's not really true. He asks, is it nonsensical to say, stand roughly there? Do I have to specify with Cartesian coordinates exactly where I want you to stand? No, stand roughly there. I mean, anybody that understands English is going to understand this. He says, there's no mystery here. If you're mystified, you are mystifying yourself. And philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language. What a remarkable intellect. What a remarkable thinker. Now, there's a number of difficulties here. Difficulty number one, or actually there are a plethora of difficulties, that's not fair, but the difficulty that immediately suggests itself. How do we know when someone understands a term? Well, we know when they can use the term the way we use the term. And if they start using the term in a funny way, that is, say, if Johnny starts pointing at his pencil and saying, this is a game, we say, no, Johnny, for the 100th time, that's a pencil, that's not a game. And if Johnny has any brains at all, you figure eventually Johnny's going to come up with the idea that, look, games are things like chess and checkers. Johnny, learn the language, you can do it. Well, here's the idea. Our standard for knowing whether Johnny understands the word game is his behavior. And what this does, it comes very, very close to abolishing the mind or the psyche or the internal element in understanding. In other words, this theory of whether you understand the term game or not refers not at all to your mental experiences, to your subjective understanding of it. It refers to the way you behave. And if you don't show me by some kind of behavior whether you understand the word game or not, I, strictly speaking, can't tell whether you can do that. So in other words, it comes perilously close to turning into a kind of philosophical behaviorism. What Wittgenstein does is drive the world of the psyche, of the ego, of the subject, back, not to the point where he abolishes it, as many of the more radical logical positivists do. Otto Neurath does that. A.J. Ayer, I believe, does it as well. But what he does is drive the ego or the psyche or the subject back to not non-existence, but to the point where to the level where it is a dimensionless point that takes up no space and that contains nothing within it. It is a black box entirely impenetrable to all other people. He does not deny that people have a self or an ego, but in fact, he says that that's inaccessible to us. Imagine the uncommon loneliness of such a man. It means that you can't know other minds or know other people. It comes very, very close to that. So this behaviorism is expressed quite ably and again quite poetically and in a way that's not at all easy to refute. And the examples, Wittgenstein again can baffle us with the things on our kitchen table. He can baffle you with anything, with any everyday common object or common activity. And in particular, he says makes a number of observations or thought experiments. For example, he says, suppose we taught a child, or suppose we met someone who had been taught how to do addition problems. Many of us can do that. It's simple arithmetic. And suppose we wanted to know if a given person, say a person in one of these rows, knows how to do addition. I might give him some addition problems and ask him to do them and then look and see if in fact he gets the right answer. And if he gets the right answer for any length of time, I say, okay, yeah, this person knows how to do addition. Independent of testing them in that way, of seeing them perform some kind of action, of engaging in some kind of behavior which gives me grounds to say that, could I ever possibly have grounds for thinking that a person understands addition? Imagine the following case, and this is the kind of queer brilliance that you get in Wittgenstein. He says, imagine the case of someone that claimed to understand addition, but never, ever had done an addition problem on paper and had never given anyone any evidence of understanding addition. Just says, I've done a great many sums, but I've done them all in my head. Imagine the strange condition you were in now. How can we tell if this person understands addition? Assuming that they're not willing to do anything out here in the world that we can see. Take it on faith? Well, imagine where that's going to lead us. Imagine people claiming that they understood Swedish, with the exception that they had never spoken any Swedish, and they had never read anything in Swedish, but they want you to believe that they know it. Do you see the problem? That is to say, what possible criterion could we have for ascribing to a person an understanding of an idea or a concept or a process unless it was somewhere in their behavior? The only other alternative is to read their mind, to hold hands, have a seance to see if we can directly get access to it. And since that's impossible, back to behaviorism, back to the standard of external activity as the touchstone for whether Johnny understands this. And as a matter of practical fact, there should come as no surprise that every first grade teacher, when they want to find out if the kids in the class understand addition, they give them a test. Not because they like making the kids nervous, but because the only way to find out whether they understand addition or not is to have them do some addition problems. You can't take it on faith. A remarkable breakthrough. The difficulty with it is that it tends to lock us within our own psyche, and that it tends to make it very hard to give behavior which would give us satisfactory reason to believe in certain kinds of experience. Wittgenstein says in the Investigations, what is the aim of your philosophy? To allow the fly to get out of the fly bottle. In other words, we're taken in by the language that we've been brought up on, and we tend to get confused because language itself is full of odd quirks and odd facts which only can be determined and only can be unraveled in the way words get used. So back to the theme, don't ask for the meaning, ask for the use. If you're still unclear as to what you're doing, then ask, how is this word learned? So for Wittgenstein, philosophy in the Investigations turns out to be a kind of therapy. We have conceptual Charlie horses, or we have conceptual diseases, and he's going to be a trainer or an intellectual doctor who's going to help us improve our thinking, and he's going to offer us therapy for the misapprehensions and the confusions introduced into our thinking by our use of language. Now, the problem with the Investigations is that it's incomplete. One of the difficulties is, and here's the real point, is that there's an infinite number of overlapping language games, and not only is it incomplete, but philosophy itself is incomplete. The incompleteness of this book gestures at the fact that there is no ultimate finale to the philosophical enterprise, which is a total reversal of what he thought he had done in the early part of his career. He thought he had solved all philosophical problems. There's nothing left to talk about. Everything else is just mopping up the confusions that happen to be left over from 2,500 years of Platonism. Now, we know not only is philosophy not ending, but it's never ending. It's never ending because human puzzlement never ends, in fact, there is no one universal skeleton key. There's no one universal thread which leads us out of the labyrinth of language. All we can do is learn the local rules used in various communities and in various forms of life with regard to certain linguistic activities. And once Johnny learns how to use the word chair and refers to things like that with it, well then Johnny understands what a chair is. And that is true not just for chairs, but it's true for all of language. And what he's done is undeceive us and make unambiguous things which we thought were problems, but in fact are not problems. The problem lies not with the world, the problem lies not with language, the problem lies with the unreasonable set of demands and expectations that we bring to it. The therapy that he is performing in the large-scale sense is to rid us of the Platonic demand for ultimate certainty and go to an essentially pragmatic standard which says, if it works, it works. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. If Johnny can use the word chair, then Johnny understands chair, whether he can tell you what the form of the chair is or not. As a matter of fact, it may be a waste of time because in all probability there is no form of the chair. There is no one quality which every chair has and only chairs have. All we have is the overlapping language games. Some of them are more precise than others. If some are found too ambiguous for our purposes, we can increase the precision with which we use language at any time, and we can increase it to the point where we find it useful again. And then there's no point in taking our precision any further except for points of pedantry, because if it isn't fixed, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. He rescues us from centuries of unnecessary worry. He helps us avoid a lifetime of the frustrating pursuit of something that's not there. He says, or in a way, it's a way of going back to the first line of the Tractatus, the world is all that is the case. And what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. In the Tractatus, being a logical, scientific kind of a guy, he said that there were no way that we could express propositions in ethics or in theology or in aesthetics. It's too gooey and ambiguous for him. Later on, he comes back with this idea of the fuzzy photo. We can talk about ethics, we can talk about aesthetics, we can talk about theology. The difficulty is that they're very ambiguous, very fuzzy words. The question is the fuzziness of our discourse an impediment to understanding each other or not? If we get an understanding of what someone is talking about when they talk about beauty or about God or about religion, if it communicates with you, and you can tell by whether they use it in the proper way, well then it's working just fine. If it's too ambiguous for our purposes, then sharpen it up. We are rescued not only from an extreme skepticism, we are rescued from chasing our own tails around like puppies. In that respect, Wittgenstein represents a retreat from philosophical hubris. He is a hero in the Socratic sense because he's not only willing to criticize others, he's willing to criticize himself, and he's unwilling to accept the flattery that comes with philosophical breakthroughs when you yourself have conscientious misgivings about what you've written. As an example of intellectual honesty, Ludwig Wittgenstein is without peer in the last 500 years of philosophy. One of the greatest thinkers, and in that respect, one of the greatest souls of all. And as a matter of just empirical, personal fact for him, he was one of the loneliest and most, how can I put it, distant of men. And part of it comes from this extreme logical rigor. Part of it comes from this willingness to ask new questions, willingness to even undermine one's own conclusions. But it also connects to the fact that Wittgenstein himself wanted to bring philosophy down to this world. And it amounts to the idea that what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. And the domain of silence, it turns out in the investigations, is not as great as we had thought.